Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the grand, historical conclusion of the Seven Singular Masters archive, focusing specifically on Chapter 178, the seventh inversion. Now, right off the bat, I want to be clear. This isn't just some standard fantasy wrap-up. What we're actually looking at is an incredibly profound, meticulously detailed systemic breakdown. It maps out exactly how a society teetering on the edge of total existential collapse manages to pull itself back from the brink. We're going to treat this text exactly as the authentic historical archive it presents itself to be, and really get into the structural, mechanical, nitty-gritty of how this final shadow was dismantled. So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the topography of Lethe, break down the vectors of indifference, and then dive into the philosophical confrontation. After that, we'll walk through the reversion act, analyze the master data grid, and wrap things up with the wet ledger. All right, part one, the topography of Lethe. To really grasp this inversion, we have to understand the sheer physical reality of where this is all going down. The archive pulls us into the northern frost sphere, right into Lethe. Imagine a brilliantly engineered metropolis constructed entirely out of white granite and polished silver. And the craziest part? It's built deep inside a massive volcanic caldera. The whole place only survives because of this incredibly intricate network of geothermal conduits. But Lethe is dying. It's falling under a phenomenon the archive calls the absolute zero of the soul. This is the seventh shadow, traditionally known as Sloth. But what's fascinating is how the text defines this threat. It's not a violent monster. It's not a raging storm or an invading army. It's a quiet, frictionless deceleration. It's this heavy, creeping, systemic indifference that basically infects the city, whispering to the citizens that human effort is mathematically irrelevant when stacked up against the cold, infinite cosmos. And that brings us to the absolute core of the historical conflict in Chapter 178. On one hand, you have this silent deceleration of absolute zero. And honestly, it's seductive. It represents a sterile, effortless stasis. It's that dark little promise that if you just stop trying, all the pain and exhaustion of existence just goes away. But on the other hand, you have dynamic purpose. And I love that the archive doesn't paint this as some magical easy fix. It explicitly defines dynamic purpose as the agonizing, purposeful friction of life. Because living, building a society, maintaining hope, it all requires friction. It requires heat. It requires brutal effort. Moving right along to part two, the three vectors of indifference. You see, the collapse of this city isn't just some random accident. It's highly organized. The shadow paralyzes Lethe by attacking three specialized local anchors, or structural nodes. We're talking administration, philosophy, and engineering. Let's methodically dissect how each of these pillars simply crumbles under the weight of cosmic futility. First up, representing administration, we have High Archon Varis. Completely paralyzed by the sheer, crushing futility of history, he just stops governing. He locks himself away in the Obsidian Registry and literally allows vital public welfare and heat allocation petitions to freeze on his desk, completely unread. It's pure administrative paralysis. Then, over at the Lyceum, representing philosophy, we have Master Philosopher Olyn. He actually authors something called the Covenant of the Void. This is a doctrine that deliberately sedates the youth of Lethe by teaching them that all moral choices, all ambitions, are just biological errors. He completely intellectualizes surrendering to the cold. I mean, because nothing says higher education quite like teaching the next generation that caring about anything is just a glitch in your biology, right? But the crucial anchor, the absolute most important node in all of this, is Chief Engineer Martha. She is literally the architect of the city's heat. The text places her deep underground, the subterranean geothermal core, sitting totally motionless directly in front of the dying console. And she's not physically trapped in there, she's psychologically bound. She's actively being tempted by that absolute effortless stillness of the void we talked about earlier. If she gives in to this seductive exhaustion, the entire geothermal conduit network goes down and Lethe freezes permanently. End of story.
So what happens next? Part 3, the philosophical confrontation.
This is the moment Ilyanmar and Vassago descend into those freezing deep furnace vaults. But they don't show up to stage a physical intervention. They don't bring swords. Instead, Ilyanmar introduces an entirely different kind of weapon, famously recorded in the archive as the calculus of inertial resistance. I really want to take our time here and explicitly break down the Tier 1 cosmic equations presented in this text, because this is where the historical archive becomes, frankly, brilliant. The text gives us two core mathematical formulations. First, there's the index of absolute stasis, denoted as omega stasis. This equation accounts for the sheer gravitational pull of cosmic futility. It uses a very specific variable called mu, which is the coefficient of systemic indifference. If you look at this equation alone, stasis is a mathematical certainty, but that assumes humans are purely linear, predictable entities. Enter Ilyanmar with equation 17.2, the vector of intentional propulsion overcoming stasis threshold, or psi ignition. This equation mathematically proves that individual free will acts as a non-linear variable. When you factor in what the archive calls the constant of intrinsic purpose, it mathematically demonstrates that one single, agonizing human choice completely shatters the perfect math of indifference. Choice literally breaks stasis. Which brings us to the physical application of that math. Part 4. The Reversion Act. We've seen a theory. Now it's time to trace Martha's direct, physical confrontation against the shadow's vision of a frozen future. This is the ignition sequence. Step 1. Guided by Ilyan's math, Martha has to shatter the hypnotic numbness of the void. It actually kicks off with a literal Flintstone spark provided by Ilyanmar, a tiny localized moment of physical friction to wake her up. Then, Martha has to actively choose the agonizing physical friction of life over that sterile perfection of stasis. She steps up and grips the massive 6-foot iron ignition lever. The text is incredibly visceral here. It specifically notes her frozen skin tearing as she forces her exhausted, freezing muscles to move. But she does it. She physically slams that heavy iron lever home. The systemic reaction is instantaneous. Releasing that lever triggers a massive, pressurized pulse of volcanic fire straight from the caldera. The raw heat violently rushes through the conduits, totally vaporizing the encroaching gray frost and converting it into pressurized, life-giving steam. In this one visceral, brutal mechanical action, the shadow of Sloth is defeated. And through that heat and friction, the sovereign virtue of dynamic purpose is birthed, right there in Lethe. It is the ultimate real-world proof of intentional propulsion overcoming stasis. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Part 5, the comprehensive master data grid. If you flip to page 12 of the archive, you find this incredibly detailed 7-part matrix analyzing the systemic aftermath of the inversions. It maps out the conquered sin, the metropolitan center, the local anchor, and the resulting sovereign virtue for all 7 events. What this matrix explicitly proves, and this is vital, is that these singular masters aren't some sort of magical, mythical saviors. Not at all. They are systemic stabilizers. Together, they form a cross-regional grid that operates exactly like a massive collective circuit breaker, automatically triggering to prevent the total collapse of the human spirit. But the true genius of this archive is that it doesn't just stop with the heroes who pulled the levers. It introduces the democratic framework of this entire world-building system. The automatic compensatory balance of this massive cross-regional grid, it isn't actually sustained by a singular master throwing a giant iron lever once a century. No, systemic stability is supported entirely by the micro-victories of conscious daily labor executed by common citizens. The everyday choice to get up, go to work, and care for one another. That is the actual ongoing engine of dynamic purpose. These massive cosmic inversions we read about are really just macro reflections of everyday human choices. Finally, let's pull all the way out for part 6, the forever wet ledger. The narrative shifts to this grand cosmic perspective. Out in the frozen gray wastes, we find the ancient watcher, Belial, logging this final historical entry into his cosmic book. He notes that the 7th pillar is officially stabilized, and the grid is completely online. But rather than a tidy, happy ending, he leaves the record with this incredibly profound, heavy warning. The ink on the ledger of free will remains permanently wet.
What Belial is telling us is that stabilization is never a finished product. The victory against stasis is never, ever permanent. Because the system relies completely on that democratic framework, the daily grueling choices of regular people, the ledger simply cannot be closed. It strictly requires every single subsequent generation to actively choose the friction of work over the seductive, easy emptiness of the void. So the ultimate takeaway from this historical archive isn't just a story about what Chief Engineer Martha accomplished in a volcano. It's a direct challenge to you. If the math requires continuous friction, how will you choose dynamic purpose today? Think about where you might be letting the absolute zero of indifference creep into your own life. And ask yourself, what lever do you need to pull today to generate a little heat?